The flames danced higher than the tallest pine on Daisy Adams' property, turning her small homestead into a funeral pyre that illuminated the Wyoming night sky like an unholy beacon. She stood barefoot in her nightgown, clutching her father's pocket, watched the only possession she'd managed to save as her entire life burned before her eyes. Behind her, the sound of galloping hooves grew louder, but Daisy didn't turn around, transfixed by the destruction unfolding before her. Wyoming Territory, 1872, Miss Adams. A deep voice called out as the rider approached. "Miss Adams, are you hurt?" Daisy finally tore her gaze from the inferno that had been her home just an hour earlier. Through tear-blurred vision, she made out the silhouette of a man dismounting a chestnut stallion. In the flickering firelight, she recognized him as Keith Quinn, a cowboy who worked at the Double R Ranch several miles to the north. She'd seen him in town occasionally, exchanging polite nods, but they'd never shared more than a few words. I'm not hurt," she managed, her voice barely audible over the crackling flames. Her blonde hair, usually neatly pinned, hung loose around her shoulders, wild and tangled. At 23, Daisy had lived alone on this homestead for 2 years since her father's passing, proving up the land claim and making it on her own. Keith approached cautiously, his tall frame casting a long shadow. At 27, he'd worked cattle for nearly a decade, his face weathered by sun and wind, but his blue eyes remained clear and sharp. "I saw the fire from the ridge. What happened?" "Land jumpers," Daisy said bitterly, wrapping her arms around herself against the night chill. "3 men on horseback. They called me a claim-stealing woman who had no business homesteading alone. Said this was their territory." Her voice cracked. "They torched it before I could even grab my shotgun." Keith removed his jacket and draped it over her shoulders. The worn leather was warm and smelled of horse, tobacco, and prairie grass. "Do you have somewhere to go tonight? Family in town?" Daisy shook her head. "I'm alone in Riverton. My nearest neighbor is the Wilsons, but they're a half-day's ride." She glanced at the burning cabin, watching as the roof collapsed with a shower of sparks. Everything she owned was in that cabin: her father's books, her mother's quilt, the papers proving her claim. All gone. "I'll take you to town then," Keith said firmly. "Mrs. Holloway at the boarding house will give you a room. And leave my land unguarded." Daisy's voice rose sharply. "That's exactly what they want, for me to abandon my claim so they can take it." Keith studied her for a long moment, taking in her determined stance despite the devastation around her. "You're right," he said finally. "That's likely their plan." He looked thoughtful, then nodded as if making a decision. "I've got some canvas in my saddlebags. We can rig up a temporary shelter tonight. Tomorrow I'll help you start rebuilding." "Why would you do that?" Daisy asked, suspicion creeping into her voice. Living alone had taught her to be wary of unexpected kindness, especially from men. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said simply. "No one should lose their home like this." He gestured toward the embers. "And those land jumpers need to learn that folks in Riverton Territory stick together." Daisy studied him in the dying firelight. His face was honest, open, nothing like the sneering expressions of the men who'd set fire to her home. Still, she hesitated. "I can't pay you much." "I'm not asking for payment, Miss Adams." "Then what are you asking for?" A slight smile crossed Keith's face. "Nothing at all, just the satisfaction of seeing justice done." He extended his hand. "Do we have an agreement?" Daisy looked at his outstretched hand, calloused from years of ranch work. She had few options, and the thought of rebuilding alone was overwhelming. After a moment's hesitation, she took his hand. "We have an agreement, Mr. Quinn." "Keith," he corrected. "If we're going to be building a cabin together, we might as well use first names." "Daisy," she replied, feeling some of her tension ease despite everything. Keith nodded and turned toward his horse. "Let's see about that shelter for tonight, Daisy. Tomorrow's going to be a long day." While Keith set up a makeshift tent from canvas and rope, Daisy salvaged what she could from the smoldering ruins of her cabin. There wasn't much: a cast iron skillet buried under fallen timbers, a few intact jars of preserves from the root cellar, and a charred corner of a photograph showing her parents on their wedding day. By dawn, they'd created a rudimentary camp. Keith had insisted on keeping watch through the night, refusing Daisy's protests that he needed sleep. "I'll catch a few hours when the sun's up," he'd said. "Nights when trouble tends to ride in." As the first light of morning spread across the eastern sky, Daisy studied her property with clear eyes. The cabin was a total loss, but the well remained intact, as did her small barn where, thankfully, she'd kept no livestock since selling her milk cow the previous month. The vegetable garden was partially trampled where the raiders had ridden through, but her tools in the barn were untouched. "We'll need lumber," Keith said, approaching with 2 cups of coffee brewed over a small fire. "There's a stand of pines about a mile west that would work." Daisy accepted the coffee gratefully. "I can't ask you to cut down trees for me." "You didn't ask," he reminded her, his eyes crinkling slightly at the corners. "I offered. Besides, I won't be doing it alone. We'll work together." "You have your own job at Double R," she pointed out. "Won't Mr. Reynolds miss you?" Keith shook his head. "I spoke with him yesterday. It's the slow season, and he's agreed to spare me for a couple of weeks. He didn't mention that he'd had to promise to work additional shifts upon his return, or that he'd be forfeiting part of his wages." Daisy's eyes widened. "Weeks? I can't possibly—" "It's settled," Keith interrupted gently. "Now drink your coffee. We need to get to town for supplies." The ride to Riverton was quiet, with Keith leading and Daisy riding double behind him, her arms cautiously wrapped around his waist. She was acutely aware of his solid presence, the steady rhythm of his breathing, and the careful way he guided his horse over rough terrain to make the ride easier for her. Riverton was a growing settlement of just over 300 souls, with a main street featuring a general store, a bank, 2 saloons, a church, and various other businesses. As they rode down the dusty street, Daisy felt eyes on them, not just because she was wearing the same soot-stained nightgown and Keith's jacket, but because riding double with a man was bound to start tongues wagging. "Perhaps we should separate here," she suggested quietly. "Nonsense," Keith replied. "Let people talk if they want to. We have nothing to hide." He helped her down in front of Jensen's General Store, where the proprietor, Harold Jensen, was sweeping the porch. The older man looked up in surprise. "Miss Adams, good heavens, what's happened to you?" Within minutes, Daisy found herself surrounded by concerned townspeople as the news of the attack spread. Sheriff Tanner, a burly man with a graying mustache, took notes and promised to ride out to investigate. "Land jumpers have been causing trouble all along the territory line," he said grimly. "Likely the same bunch that ran the Peterson widow off her claim last month. I'll send wires to the neighboring counties." Mrs. Holloway, the boarding house owner, insisted on taking Daisy to get cleaned up and properly clothed, while Keith negotiated with Jensen for building supplies on credit. "I'll vouch for Miss Adams," Keith told the shopkeeper. "She's good for it once she gets back on her feet." Jensen nodded, his kind face serious. "No need for vouching. Daisy Adams has always paid her bills promptly. She can have whatever she needs." By midday, they were headed back to Daisy's property with a wagon loaded with supplies: nails, tools, food staples, 2 blankets, and a small tent that would serve better than their makeshift shelter. Several townsmen had volunteered to ride out in a few days to help with raising the cabin walls once the foundation was laid. As they traveled, Daisy glanced at Keith's profile. "Thank you," she said simply. "I don't know what I would have done without your help today." Keith kept his eyes on the trail ahead. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," Daisy countered. "Not anyone. Most men would have told me to give up the claim that a woman has no business homesteading alone." Keith was quiet for a moment before answering. "My mother raised 3 boys on her own after my father died in the war. She taught us that a person's worth isn't in their gender but in their character." He glanced at her. "And from what I can see, Miss Adams, you've got character in spades." Daisy felt a warmth bloom in her chest that had nothing to do with the spring sunshine. For the first time since watching her home burn, she allowed herself a small smile. The next 5 days fell into a grueling pattern. They would rise at dawn, Keith insisting on taking the first watch each night despite Daisy's protests. After a simple breakfast, they'd work until sunset clearing debris, hauling stones for the foundation and felling trees for lumber. Keith taught Daisy how to use a 2-person saw, standing close behind her to demonstrate the proper motion. "Not too fast," he instructed, his breath warm against her ear. "Slow and steady wins the race." Daisy tried to ignore the flutter in her stomach at his proximity. She had no time for such feelings, she reminded herself. Her focus needed to be on rebuilding her home and securing her claim. Each evening, Keith would leave to patrol the property boundaries, rifle in hand. "Just making sure our friends don't return," he explained casually. But Daisy understood the seriousness behind his words. The land jumpers could come back at any time, and next time, they might do worse than burn a cabin. On the 6th day, while they were taking a brief rest after setting the cornerstone of the foundation, Daisy finally asked the question that had been bothering her. "Keith, why are you really helping me? And don't say it's just the right thing to do. There must be more to it." Keith took a long drink from his canteen before answering. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and gazed out at the rolling Wyoming landscape. "2 years ago, my brother tried homesteading out near the Montana border," he said quietly. "Similar situation, land jumpers wanted his claim. They didn't just burn his cabin, though. They shot him while he was trying to escape the flames." His jaw tightened. No one helped him. No one stood up for what was right. Daisy's heart constricted. "I'm so sorry," Keith nodded, acknowledging her sympathy. "I swore then that if I ever saw something similar happening, I wouldn't look the other way." He turned to look at her directly. "But there's more to it than that, Daisy. I've watched you in town these past 2 years. The way you've handled yourself after your father passed, how you've worked this land on your own. I respect that. I respect you." Daisy felt her cheeks flush, unused to such direct praise. "Besides," he added with a hint of a smile, "you make the best apple pie in the county, Mrs. Holloway's doesn't come close, though don't tell her I said so." Daisy laughed, the sound surprising her after days of strain and worry. "My mother's recipe. I'll have to make you one when we have an oven again." "I'll hold you to that promise," Keith said, his eyes lingering on her face before he stood and offered his hand to help her up. "Now, let's get back to work. Those stones won't set themselves." On the 8th day, the promised help from town arrived 6 men with tools and strong backs. With their assistance, the cabin walls began to take shape. The new structure was slightly larger than her original home, with Keith suggesting improvements to the layout. "If you put the stove here," he explained, sketching in the dirt with a stick, "it'll heat both rooms more efficiently in winter." Daisy nodded, impressed by his practical knowledge. "Where did you learn about building cabins?" "My father was a carpenter before the war," Keith explained. I worked alongside him from the time I was old enough to hold a hammer. The men from town departed as sunset approached, promising to return in a few days to help with the roof. As they rode away, Daisy stood next to Keith, watching the golden light play across the half-built walls of her new home. "It's really happening," she said softly. "A week ago, I thought I'd lost everything." Keith turned to her, his expression serious. "You're stronger than you know, Daisy. This is your achievement, not mine." "You're wrong," she replied, holding his gaze. "I couldn't have done this alone." Something shifted in the air between them, a tension that had been building over days of working side by side, sharing meals and exchanging life stories during brief rest periods. Keith took a step closer, and Daisy found herself holding her breath. The moment was shattered by the distant sound of approaching horses. Keith's hand immediately went to his holstered revolver. "Get inside the barn," he said quietly, all warmth gone from his voice, replaced by steel. "I'm not hiding," Daisy protested, already moving toward where her shotgun leaned against a tree stump. "Daisy," Keith's voice was urgent. "Please." Something in his tone made her hesitate. With a reluctant nod, she retreated to the barn door but kept her shotgun ready. 3 riders appeared over the ridge, the same men who had burned her cabin. Daisy was certain. Her heart pounded as they approached, their faces hard and purposeful. Keith stood his ground in front of the half-built cabin, one hand resting casually on his holster. He waited until the men were within speaking distance before calling out. "Evening, gentlemen. Something I can help you with." The leader, a heavy-set man with a scraggly beard, reined his horse to a stop. "This doesn't concern you, Cowboy. Our business is with the woman." "Miss Adams is under my protection," Keith replied evenly. "Any business you have with her you can discuss with me." The men exchanged glances, clearly not expecting resistance. "We're just making sure she understood our message," the leader said with a sneer. "This land is spoken for." Keith's posture remained relaxed, but Daisy could see the tension in his shoulders. "Funny thing about that. I checked the land office records in town. This property is legally claimed by Miss Adams. Has been for over 2 years now." "Papers don't mean nothing out here," the second man spat. "This is cattle country, not farmland. The law says otherwise," Keith replied. "Now I suggest you boys move along. Sheriff Tanner is keeping a close eye on this property these days." The leader's hand moved toward his gun. "You're outnumbered, Cowboy." From the barn doorway, Daisy stepped into view, shotgun raised. "Not exactly," she called out. The 3 men stared at her, then at Keith, assessing the situation. After a tense moment, the leader jerked his head. "This ain't over," he growled, wheeling his horse around. "Actually," Keith called after them, "it is over. Miss Adams has neighbors now who won't stand for this kind of behavior. Spread the word." The men rode off, dust billowing behind them. Keith remained standing, watching until they disappeared from sight, then turned to Daisy with a frown. "I thought I told you to stay hidden." Daisy lowered the shotgun, her heart still racing. "I don't take orders well, Mr. Quinn. Besides, I couldn't let you face them alone." Keith's expression softened. "You're a stubborn woman, Daisy Adams." "So I've been told," she replied with a small smile. That night, after a simple dinner, Daisy insisted that Keith get some proper rest. "You can't keep taking the night watch. You're exhausted." Keith shook his head. "They might come back tonight. They'll be angry after being confronted." "Then we'll both keep watch," Daisy declared. "In shifts. I'll take the first one and you can take over at midnight." Keith looked like he wanted to argue but was too tired to put up much resistance. "Wake me at the first sign of trouble," he insisted. "I promise," Daisy said solemnly. As Keith settled into his bedroll near the campfire, Daisy took a position on a stump with her shotgun across her lap. The night was clear, with countless stars spread across the Wyoming sky. She could hear the soft hooting of an owl, the rustle of wind through prairie grass, and Keith's steady breathing as exhaustion quickly pulled him into sleep. Looking at his face, relaxed in slumber, Daisy admitted to herself what she'd been trying to deny for days. She was falling for this quiet, steadfast cowboy who had come to her rescue without asking for anything in return. It wasn't just gratitude she felt when he smiled at her, or pride when he complimented her work. It was something deeper, something that made her chest ache in a way that was both painful and sweet, but such feelings were dangerous. Once the cabin was rebuilt, Keith would return to his life at the Double R, and she would go back to her solitary existence. Getting attached would only lead to heartache. Still, as she watched over him through the quiet night, Daisy allowed herself to imagine a different future, one where she wasn't alone, where the cabin they were building together would be their home, not just hers. By the time she gently shook Keith awake for his watch, Daisy had firmly pushed such thoughts aside. Practical matters came first: survival, rebuilding, securing her claim. Dreams of romance were a luxury she couldn't afford. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor, Sheriff Tanner, riding up just as they were laying out logs for the day's work. "Miss Adams, Quinn," he greeted them, dismounting with a grunt. "Thought I'd stop by and see how the rebuilding is coming along." "We're making good progress," Daisy replied, wiping her hands on her apron. The sheriff nodded, casting an appreciative eye over the partially constructed cabin. "Solid work." He turned to Keith. "Got some news you both should hear. Caught one of your land jumpers in town yesterday, drunk and bragging about burning out a stubborn woman homesteader." Keith's expression hardened. "Which one?" "The skinny one with the scar across his chin. Name's Jackson Reed. He's cooling his heels in my jail, facing charges of arson and trespassing." The sheriff looked grim. "His friends are still out there, though. The ringleader is a man named Silas Farrow, been causing trouble all through the territory." "Farrow," Keith repeated, committing the name to memory. "What about the third man? Don't have a name yet, but Reed will talk eventually." Tanner adjusted his hat. "Just wanted to warn you to stay alert. Farrow's not the type to give up easily, and he'll be extra riled now that his partner's locked up." "We appreciate the warning, Sheriff," Daisy said. "And the good news about Reed." After the sheriff departed, Keith and Daisy worked in thoughtful silence for a while. Finally, Daisy spoke. "At least there's one less of them to worry about." Keith nodded, hammering a wooden peg into place. "But Farrow's the dangerous one. Men like him, they take things personally. He'll see your persistence as a challenge to his authority." Daisy straightened, pushing a strand of hair from her face. "I'm not giving up my land, Keith. Not for Farrow, not for anyone." Keith looked at her with something like pride in his eyes. "I know, Daisy, and I'm not letting you face him alone." The work continued through the day, both of them more vigilant after the sheriff's visit. That evening, as they sat by the fire eating a rabbit stew Daisy had prepared, Keith cleared his throat. "I've been thinking," he began, staring into the flames. "Once the cabin is finished, you'll still be vulnerable out here alone." Daisy tensed. "I managed before." "I know you did," Keith said quickly. "That's not what I meant, I just—" He hesitated, then continued more firmly. "I was thinking I could stay on a while longer, just until we're sure Farrow's moved on or been caught." Daisy studied his face in the firelight, trying to read his intentions. "You can't put your life on hold indefinitely, Keith. The Double R will need you back." "Actually," Keith said, setting down his tin plate, "I've been considering a change. Mr. Reynolds mentioned there's a small piece of property adjoining yours to the west that's unclaimed. Good grazing land." Daisy's heart skipped a beat. "You're thinking of homesteading," Keith nodded slowly. "I've saved most of my wages these past few years, enough for a modest start. I could run a few head of cattle, maybe some horses." He looked at her directly. "We'd be neighbors, close enough that if you ever needed help." "Is that what you want?" Daisy asked softly. "To be my neighbor?" Something flickered in Keith's eyes, uncertainty, perhaps, or a deeper emotion he wasn't ready to name. "I think it would be a good arrangement, for both of us." Daisy wasn't sure if she felt disappointed or relieved. Part of her had hoped. He might be suggesting something more personal. "It would be nice to have a friendly neighbor," she agreed, keeping her tone light. Keith seemed about to say more when the distant crack of a rifle shot split the night air. Instantly, he was on his feet, pulling Daisy down with him. "Get to the barn," he ordered, drawing his revolver. "Stay low." This time, Daisy didn't argue. Crouching low, she made her way to the barn while Keith moved in the opposite direction, using the half-built cabin for cover. Another shot rang out, the bullet splintering wood where Keith's head had been moments before. Daisy's heart hammered in her chest as she reached the barn and pulled her shotgun from where it leaned against the wall. From her position, she could make out a figure moving among the trees about 100 yards from the cabin. Without hesitation, she aimed the shotgun in that direction and fired, not expecting to hit anything at that distance but hoping to keep the shooter's head down. The strategy worked. The figure ducked for cover, giving Keith a chance to change positions. Daisy saw him sprinting toward the well, which offered better protection. For several minutes, an eerie silence fell. Then Keith's voice called out, surprisingly calm, "Pharaoh, this is a poor way to settle a land dispute." A harsh laugh came from the trees. "No dispute to settle, Quinn. The woman's claim is forfeit once she's gone." "There are easier claims to jump," Keith replied. "Why are you so set on this one?" "Because she needs to be taught a lesson," came the sneering response. "Women don't belong on the frontier, and they sure as hell don't belong on prime grazing land." Daisy's blood boiled at the man's words. Before she could think better of it, she called out, "My father died proving up this claim, Pharaoh. I'm not leaving it to a coward who shoots from the shadows." Her outburst drew another shot, this one pinging off the metal roof of the barn. Keith used the distraction to fire 3 rapid shots toward Pharaoh's position, forcing the man to retreat deeper into the trees. The standoff continued for nearly an hour, with occasional exchanges of gunfire but no clear advantage to either side. Finally, Daisy heard the sound of a horse galloping away. "He's running," she called to Keith. "Stay put," Keith warned. "Could be a trick." They remained in their defensive positions for another half-hour before Keith finally signaled it was safe to come out. Daisy rushed to meet him in the clearing, relieved to see he was unharmed. "He'll be back," Keith said grimly, reloading his revolver. "And next time he might bring reinforcements." Daisy nodded, the reality of her situation sinking in. "I can't ask you to keep risking your life for my land, Keith." Keith holstered his weapon and turned to her with an intensity she hadn't seen before. "You're not asking, Daisy, I'm offering, and it's not just about the land." "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Keith stepped closer, close enough that she could see the stubble on his jaw, the tiny scar above his right eyebrow. "I think you know what I mean." Before Daisy could respond, he continued, "These past days, working alongside you, talking with you, I've come to care for you, Daisy. More than I should, perhaps." Daisy's breath caught in her throat. "Keith, you don't have to say anything," he interrupted gently. "I know the timing is all wrong. You're rebuilding your life, and I'm just the cowboy who happened to ride by that night. But I wanted you to know that my reasons for helping aren't entirely selfless." Daisy found herself reaching for his hand, her fingers closing around his calloused palm. "I've come to care for you too," she admitted. "But I'm afraid." "Of Pharaoh?" "No," she said with a small smile. "Of hoping for something that might not be possible." Keith's free hand came up to touch her cheek, his touch feather light. "What isn't possible, Daisy? A life where I'm not alone. Where I don't have to prove myself constantly just because I'm a woman trying to make it on my own." Keith's eyes softened. "You've already proven yourself 100 times over, to the town, to the land jumpers." His voice dropped lower. "To me." The tenderness in his voice undid her. Daisy leaned into his touch, closing her eyes briefly. When she opened them, Keith was looking at her with such warmth that it made her heart ache. "We should get some rest," he said reluctantly, letting his hand fall away. "Tomorrow will be another long day." As they prepared for another night of keeping watch, Daisy felt as though something fundamental had shifted between them. The unspoken feelings were now acknowledged, even if their future remained uncertain. The following days brought steady progress on the cabin, along with increased vigilance. Keith fashioned additional barricades around their camp, and they took turns keeping watch throughout the day as well as night. Sheriff Tanner rode out twice more, reporting that Reed had finally named the third man a drifter called Morrow who had apparently left the territory after the shooting incident. "Farrow's still out there," the sheriff warned, "and he's gathering a crew. I've sent for a deputy from the county seat, but it might be a week before he arrives." On the 14th day after the fire, the new cabin was nearly complete. The roof was on, the door hung, and the window's glass panes ordered specially from Cheyenne were installed. All that remained was the interior work: the stove, shelving, and furniture. As they stood admiring their handiwork in the afternoon sunlight, Daisy felt a surge of accomplishment and gratitude. "It's better than the original," she said, leaning slightly against Keith's solid shoulder. "It'll last a lifetime," he agreed, his arm coming naturally around her waist. Such casual touches had become common between them in recent days, each one a silent acknowledgement of their growing feelings. Keith had filed his claim for the neighboring property 2 days earlier, making their future as neighbors official. He'd already started planning a small cabin of his own, though most of his energy remained focused on completing Daisy's home first. That evening, as they prepared dinner outside, the new stove was due to arrive the following day. Keith seemed preoccupied. Finally, as they were cleaning up, he spoke. "Daisy, there's something I need to tell you." The seriousness in his tone made her look up sharply. "What is it?" Keith set down the plate he was drying and took a deep breath. "I received word from town today. Farrow broke Reed out of jail last night. They overpowered Sheriff Tanner and locked him in his own cell." Daisy paled. "Is he all right?" "He'll recover, but he won't be riding to our aid anytime soon." Keith's expression was grim. "And there's more. According to Mrs. Holloway's son who brought the message, Farrow was heard bragging in the saloon that he'd finish what he started tonight." Daisy's hand went to her throat. "Tonight?" Keith nodded. "We need to prepare. I've already moved the horses deep into the woods where they'll be safe. Now we need to decide whether to make a stand here or get you to safety in town." "I'm not abandoning my home again," Daisy said firmly. "Especially not now when it's nearly finished." Keith studied her face, then nodded slowly. "I thought you'd say that. In that case, we need to make some arrangements." Over the next hour, they transformed the newly built cabin into a fortress. Keith moved all their supplies inside, barricaded the windows with the shutters he'd built, and positioned their weapons strategically: the shotgun by the door, his rifle at the west window, and his revolver at his hip. As twilight deepened into night, they sat side by side on the cabin's single chair, waiting. The only light came from a single lantern turned low, casting long shadows across the plank floor. "Keith," Daisy said softly, breaking the tense silence. "If something happens to me tonight, nothing's going to happen to you," Keith interrupted fiercely. Daisy placed her hand on his arm. "Please, let me finish. If something happens, I want you to know these past 2 weeks have been special to me. Despite everything, I wouldn't trade them." Keith covered her hand with his own. "Daisy Adams, when this is over, there's something I want to ask you, but not now, not with this hanging over us." Daisy's heart quickened. What the sound of approaching horses cut her off. Keith was instantly on his feet, extinguishing the lantern with one quick movement. "At least 4 riders," he whispered, peering through a crack in the shutters. "Coming fast." Daisy took up position by the door with the shotgun, her hands steady despite her fear. They had discussed their strategy thoroughly. Keith would handle any threats from the windows, while Daisy would guard the door. The riders pulled up about 50 yards from the cabin, their silhouettes visible in the moonlight. A voice called out Pharaoh's voice, harsh and mocking. "Miss Adams, we've come to finish our business. Come on out and maybe we'll let your cowboy live." Keith signaled for Daisy to remain silent. After a moment, Pharaoh called again. "Have it your way. We'll burn you out again, this time for good." 2 of the riders dismounted and moved toward the cabin, carrying what appeared to be torches. Keith raised his rifle, taking careful aim through the window crack. "Stop right there," he called out. "The first man who comes any closer gets a bullet." The men hesitated, looking back toward Pharaoh for direction. In that moment of confusion, Keith fired, the shot deliberately landing in the dirt at the feet of the torch-bearers. They jumped back, dropping one of the torches, which immediately extinguished in the damp ground. "Next one won't miss," Keith warned. "There's no need for anyone to die tonight, Pharaoh. The law's already after you for jailbreak. Don't add murder to your charges." Pharaoh's laugh floated through the night air. "The law? Out here, I am the law, Quinn." What happened next unfolded in a blur of motion and sound. Pharaoh and his men charged the cabin from multiple directions. Keith fired rapidly, dropping one man with a shot to the shoulder, while Daisy held her position at the door. The wounded man's screams filled the air as his companions dragged him to safety behind a water trough. Pharaoh's voice rose above the chaos. "Burn it! Burn it now!" A flaming arrow arced toward the cabin roof. Keith swore and rushed to the back window, firing at the archer he spotted in the trees. Simultaneously, the door shuddered as someone threw their weight against it. Daisy braced herself, the shotgun aimed at heart height. When the door splintered inward, she fired without hesitation, the blast catching the intruder in the chest and throwing him backward. "Daisy," Keith called, concern in his voice. "I'm all right," she responded, already reloading. Outside, confusion seemed to be spreading among Pharaoh's men. The wounding of 2 of their number had clearly dampened their enthusiasm for the fight. Daisy could hear arguing, then Pharaoh's enraged voice ordering them to continue the assault. A second flaming arrow hit the roof, but the fresh-cut wood, still damp with sap, refused to catch properly. Keith continued firing methodically, forcing the attackers to keep their distance. The standoff might have continued indefinitely if not for an unexpected development, the sound of multiple horses approaching from the direction of town. "Riders coming," one of Pharaoh's men shouted. "Lots of them. Hold your ground," Pharaoh commanded, but his authority was already crumbling. Through the window, Daisy could make out at least a dozen mounted figures approaching at a gallop, led by a man she recognized as Harold Jensen from the general store. The townspeople had come to their aid. "Pharaoh," Jensen's voice boomed across the clearing. "We know what you did to Sheriff Tanner. Throw down your weapons." For a moment, it seemed Pharaoh might choose to fight, but faced with overwhelming numbers, his remaining men were already retreating toward their horses. With a string of curses, Pharaoh fired one last defiant shot at the cabin before wheeling his horse around and galloping away. Several of the townsmen gave chase, while others approached the cabin cautiously. "Miss Adams, Quinn, are you folks all right in there?" Keith opened the door, his rifle still at the ready. "We're fine, Jensen. Mighty glad to see you all." Jensen dismounted, his expression grim. "Mrs. Holloway's boy told us about Pharaoh's threats. We gathered as many men as we could." He glanced at the body near the door. "I see you've had trouble." "Daisy defended herself," Keith said simply, putting a protective arm around her shoulders as she emerged from the cabin. Jensen nodded. "Self-defense, clear as day. No one will question it." He turned to the other townsmen. "Check the wounded man by the trough. If he can ride, we'll take him back for the doctor to patch up before he faces charges." The aftermath was a blur of activity: townsmen securing the wounded attacker, others examining the cabin for damage, and several riding out to join the pursuit of Pharaoh. Keith refused to leave Daisy's side, his hand frequently finding hers as they answered questions and accepted the community's support. By dawn, word arrived that Pharaoh had been captured trying to cross the river 10 miles south. Sheriff Tanner, though battered, had been released from his cell and was already preparing charges against all the attackers. As the last of the townspeople departed, promising to return the next day to help with any repairs, Daisy and Keith found themselves alone again, standing in the doorway of the cabin that had withstood the assault. "It's really over," Daisy said, a note of disbelief in her voice. Keith nodded, his expression softening as he looked down at her. "You were incredible tonight. Most men I know wouldn't have shown half your courage." Daisy smiled tiredly. "I had something worth fighting for." Keith took both her hands in his, turning to face her fully. "Earlier, I mentioned there was something I wanted to ask you when this was over." Daisy's heartbeat quickened. "Yes. I've filed my claim on the neighboring property, as you know," he began, his usual confidence giving way to a touching uncertainty. "But the truth is, I don't much fancy living alone. Never have." "What are you saying, Keith?" Daisy asked, though she hoped she knew. "I'm saying that these 2 weeks have shown me what kind of woman you are, Daisy Adams. Brave, determined, kind." His thumbs traced small circles on the backs of her hands. "I'm saying I'd like to court you properly if you're willing, and if things progress as I hope they might." He took a deep breath. "Well, 1 cabin would be more efficient than 2. A slow smile spread across Daisy's face. "Mr. Quinn, are you proposing an eventual marriage of convenience? For efficiency's sake?" Keith's serious expression cracked into a rueful grin. "Not exactly. I'm proposing that I've fallen in love with you, Daisy Adams. Efficiency has nothing to do with it." Daisy's breath caught at the declaration. "Love?" "Yes, love," Keith confirmed, his voice gaining strength. "I love your courage, your determination, your kindness. I love the way you frown when you're concentrating on a task and the way you hum to yourself when you think no one's listening." He stepped closer. "I know it's fast, too fast perhaps, but out here life doesn't always give us the luxury of time." Tears welled in Daisy's eyes, but they were tears of joy. "It's not too fast," she whispered. "Not when it's right." Keith's face lit with hope. "Does that mean—" "It means I love you too," Daisy said, finally giving voice to the feelings that had been growing in her heart. "And yes, I'd be honored to have you court me, Keith Quinn." Keith's smile was radiant as he drew her into his arms. "Miss Adams, you've made me the happiest man in the Wyoming territory." As the first rays of sunrise painted the eastern sky with gold, Keith lowered his head and kissed Daisy gently, a promise of the life they would build together. The weeks that followed were busy ones for Daisy and Keith. True to his word, Keith began courting her properly, though his daily presence at her cabin raised a few eyebrows in town. The scandal was short-lived, however, especially after Reverend Collins began visiting regularly to check on the moral welfare of the situation, and found nothing but propriety. Keith slept in a small tent near the barn, while continuing to help with the final touches on Daisy's cabin. Pharaoh and his men faced justice swiftly. The territorial court sentenced them to 15 years for their crimes, bringing a satisfying conclusion to the threat that had hung over Daisy's claim. By midsummer, Keith had begun construction on his own small cabin on his neighboring property, though both he and Daisy knew it was largely for appearance's sake. Their courtship progressed naturally, each day deepening their understanding and appreciation of one another. Keith continued to work part-time at the Double R, riding out 3 days a week while developing his own small herd on his claim. Daisy's vegetable garden flourished, and she began selling excess produce in town, gradually rebuilding her savings. Each evening, without fail, Keith would patrol the boundaries of their adjoining properties before joining Daisy for dinner. The ritual began as a security measure, but evolved into a cherished routine, a quiet moment of transition from the working day to their evening together. 4 months after the fire that had brought them together, on a crisp autumn evening with leaves turning gold and red on the cottonwoods along the creek, Keith formally proposed. He'd ridden into Cheyenne the previous week, returning with a simple gold band that had belonged to his grandmother. Daisy accepted without hesitation, and 3 weeks later they were married in Riverton's white-steepled church, with what seemed like the entire town in attendance. Mrs. Holloway wept openly, while Sheriff Tanner, fully recovered from his injuries, stood proudly as Keith's best man. Their wedding night was spent in Daisy's cabin, now their cabin, the interior transformed with small touches that reflected both their personalities. Keith's father's old rocking chair next to Daisy's new quilting frame, their books intermingled on shelves Keith had crafted with loving care. As winter settled over Wyoming territory, Daisy and Keith faced the harsh season together. Snow piled high around their cabin, but inside was warmth, comfort, and the deep contentment of two people who had found in each other exactly what they needed. Keith continued his evening patrols even through the winter months, though they were more symbolic than necessary now. One evening, as he stamped the snow from his boots on the porch, he paused to look back at the peaceful landscape, remembering the fire that had first brought him to this place, to Daisy. Inside, Daisy was waiting with hot coffee and news that would change their lives forever come summer. Their family would grow by one small person. Keith's joy at learning he would be a father was boundless, his protective instincts immediately extending to Daisy's still flat stomach. Spring arrived with renewed activity. Keith expanded their livestock holdings, adding a milk cow and more chickens in preparation for their growing family. Daisy, despite her advancing pregnancy, insisted on maintaining her garden, though she accepted help more readily than before. In late July 1873, almost exactly a year after the fire, their son was born, a healthy boy they named James Thomas Quinn, after both their fathers. The birth was long and difficult, but with the assistance of Mrs. Wilson from the neighboring homestead and the town's doctor who arrived just in time, both mother and child emerged healthy. Keith, who had paced anxiously outside during the birth, held his son with trembling hands and a look of wonder that made Daisy fall in love with him all over again. "He has your eyes," Keith whispered, gently touching the infant's tiny fingers. "And your chin," Daisy replied with a tired smile. "Stubborn already." As summer faded into fall and fall gave way to another winter, the rhythm of their life settled into a pattern of work, love, and family. Keith's evening patrols continued, though they were briefer now, his eagerness to return to the warmth of their home and the joy of his family growing stronger each day. On the second anniversary of the fire, Keith and Daisy stood together on their porch, young James asleep in Daisy's arms, and looked out over their thriving homestead. What had begun in destruction had transformed into something beautiful: fields cleared and producing, cattle grazing contentedly, fruit trees beginning to bear, and most importantly, a family bound by love and mutual respect. "Do you ever think about how different things might have been if you hadn't ridden by that night?" Daisy asked softly. Keith slipped his arm around her waist, drawing her and their son closer. "I believe some things are meant to be, Daisy Quinn. If it hadn't been that night, it would have been another." Daisy leaned into his embrace, feeling the solid strength that had been her anchor through these transformative years. "I'm glad it was that night," she murmured, "even with everything that followed." Keith pressed a kiss to her temple. "So am I, my love. So am I." As the sunset painted the Wyoming sky in brilliant hues of orange and purple, Keith continued his ritual, walking the perimeter of their property one more time. Not out of fear or necessity, but as a grateful acknowledgement of all they had built together from the ashes of that terrible night. When he returned, Daisy would be waiting with their son, with dinner, with love. Their cabin, once a symbol of defiance against those who would take what wasn't theirs, had become a home filled with laughter, occasionally tears, and always the unshakable bond between two people who had found each other against all odds. And each night, without fail, Keith Quinn would stand guard over what mattered most: not just land or property, but the heart of the woman who had claimed his own, and the family they had created together in the wild beauty of the Wyoming frontier. 5 years later, their homestead had grown into a prosperous small ranch. Keith's careful management had increased their cattle herd to over 100 head, while Daisy's garden had expanded into a productive orchard. Their family had grown as well. 4-year-old Elizabeth joined her 7-year-old brother James in filling the expanded cabin with laughter and occasional chaos. Keith still rode patrol each evening, though it had evolved into a leisurely circuit of their property, often with James riding alongside on his pony. The land jumpers were long gone, Pharaoh having died in prison 3 years earlier, but the ritual remained a reminder of how their life together had begun, and the vigilance required to protect what mattered. Riverton had grown too, becoming a bustling town with a railway spur line connecting it to Cheyenne. Daisy's preserves and Keith's cattle brought good prices at market, allowing them to add modern conveniences to their home: a cast iron cookstove, glass windows in every room, even a piano for Elizabeth, who showed remarkable aptitude for music. On quiet evenings, after the children were asleep, Daisy and Keith would often sit on their porch, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains. Sometimes they spoke of the future: of sending James to school in Cheyenne someday, of Elizabeth's musical talents, of possibly adding another room to the cabin as their family continued to grow. Other times, they simply sat in comfortable silence, Keith's arm around Daisy's shoulders, her head resting against him. In those moments, no words were needed. The journey from that fiery night to this peaceful existence told its own story: one of courage, determination, and a love that had not just endured but flourished in the face of adversity. And each night, as darkness fell over the Wyoming territory, Keith Quinn would complete his patrol and return to the home and family that were his greatest treasures, all because he had once stopped to help a brave young woman whose cabin lay in ashes under a star-filled sky.